President Trump outlined new information about a missile defense system to protect the U.S. from being attacked. It's called the Golden Dome. As we make a historic announcement about the Golden Dome missile defense shield, that's something we want. We have breaking news to lead off this hour. Prime Minister Carney is taking fresh steps to reposition Canada's trade relationships. Potential that we have and consistent with Canada fully fulfilling its responsibilities. In Washington, Donald Trump delivered an ultimatum at missile point. Canada, he said, must pay an astronomical $61 billion to join America's new Golden Dome missile defense shield or become the 51st state and get protected for free. Trump blasted out the demand on social media in the dead of night. A shakedown in all but name. For Ottawa, it landed like a bombshell before dawn. A surreal choice between paying tribute or sacrificing sovereignty. For months, Trump had blasted Canada's delinquent defense spending, barely 1.4% of GDP, and even suggested the U.S. might not defend countries that underpay. Now he was weaponizing Canada's very security as leverage. Before we begin, make sure to hit the like button. It helps us beat the YouTube algorithm. In Ottawa, the response was steely resolve. Prime Minister Carney, sworn in just days earlier after Justin Trudeau's resignation amid the crisis, warned that Canadians were facing the most significant crisis of their lifetimes. President Trump claims that Canada isn't a real country. He wants to break us so America can own us. We will not let that happen, Carney declared. Trump's tariffs and annexation talk had turned a trade dispute into an existential fight for Canada's sovereignty, and Carney moved to rally the country for economic war. For Trump, the confrontation was the culmination of a world view. He had long seen trade as a zero-sum game, blasting allies and adversaries alike for taking advantage of the United States. He had slapped tariffs on China and the EU in the past. But targeting Canada, a fellow democracy and neighbor, marked a new and dangerous escalation. In Trump's eyes, Canada's trade surpluses and defense spending shortfalls were insults to be punished. At rallies, he thundered that America would no longer be anybody's sigh, framing the showdown as the righteous reckoning of a long-abused superpower. He even mused, perhaps not entirely jokingly, about annexing Canada outright to seize its wealth. Trump's base roared in approval, thrilled by the spectacle of their champion cornering a foreign government. But in the halls of Washington, seasoned officials looked on in alarm, wondering what lines might be crossed next. Before we continue, make sure to hit the subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow. In early 2025, Washington unleashed a barrage of tariffs on its northern neighbor. Trump claimed Canada had failed to stop the flow of fentanyl into the U.S. Even though Canada accounts for barely 1% of U.S. fentanyl supply and used that as a pretext to jack up tariffs on Canadian imports to 35%. Lumber, steel, aluminum, automobiles, all were suddenly taxed heavily under national security rules. Even Canadian oil and electricity exports, long mutually relied upon, were slapped with new fees. A 10% energy tariff for the first time ever. The president even bragged his tariffs would essentially permanently shut down the automobile manufacturing business in Canada. If Ottawa didn't bend, it was economic warfare in all but name. Ottawa hit back with equal ferocity. Canada imposed 25% tariffs on almost $30 billion Canadian dollars in U.S. products, a strategic list of American staples from Florida, orange juice and Georgia peanut, butter to Kentucky bourbon, Wisconsin motorcycles, and California cosmetics. It was a calculated strike on heartland industries and swing state exports aimed squarely at Trump's political base. Iconic brands suddenly lost the Canadian market overnight. Farm states, factory towns, and brewery hubs across the United States awoke to canceled orders and mounting losses. A trade war that Washington expected to be one-sided was now drawing political blood on both sides of the border. Beyond the halls of government, ordinary people were caught in the crossfire. At a GM assembly plant in Oshawa, Ontario, workers were bracing for impact, as one union leader put it. "All that could be taken away from us at any moment," he said of the cloud hanging over the factory. A part supplier employee likened the uncertainty to early pandemic days. Every shift could be the last. As U.S. orders dried up and weekend work was cut across Canada's industrial towns, families suddenly feared the U.S. market they relied on might vanish overnight. And in the United States, a similar dread spread through farm states and factory towns. The livelihood of a Michigan toolmaker or an Iowa soybean farmer now hung on a trade bond that was fraying by the day. Tariffs and counter-tariffs were not just geopolitics. They were paychecks, mortgages, and college funds on the line. For the Pentagon, the timing of this economic war was disastrous. An emergency push to replenish missile and ammunition, stockpiles drained by the war in Ukraine, and escalating global threats slammed into a wall of supply problems. Aging U.S. munitions factories, some built in the 1940s, struggled to crank out shells and rockets fast enough. It had taken 2 years and billions of dollars just to boost artillery. Shell production from 14,000 to 40,000 rounds a month, still woefully short of what Ukraine's armies burned through in a few days on the battlefield. Now the trade dispute threatened to choke off some of the critical materials and components those factories needed. America's vaunted arsenal of democracy was creaking under the strain. In Washington, this shortfall was a rude awakening. A House Armed Services Subcommittee warned that U.S. industry may be incapable of meeting the munitions demand of a war against a major power. One defense analyst, after a year studying the problem, confessed that it's a miracle the U.S. military has anything that blows up ever. The Pentagon, accustomed to projecting strength, was now scrambling to explain why the world's richest military could run out of bullets. America's war machine was being humbled, its weakness exposed in real time, and rivals were taking note. By mid-year, consumer prices were surging on both sides of the border. U.S. homebuilders calculated that new tariffs had added roughly $10,900 to the cost of a typical new house as lumber and other material costs skyrocketed. Auto dealers, a 25%. Duty on Canadian-made cars would hit American car buyers with thousands of dollars in higher prices. Already strained by pandemic inflation, families now felt another squeeze at the checkout line. Polls showed most Americans believed the tariff war would raise prices and hurt both the U.S. and Canadian economies, a prediction that was swiftly becoming reality. Politically, Trump's hardball tactics were starting to backfire at home. Economists warned the escalating tariffs could tip the U.S. into recession, and Wall Street began flashing red. Even Trump's own party showed signs of rebellion. In early April, the Senate narrowly approved a resolution to revoke the Canada tariffs, a stunning rebuke from Trump's fellow Republicans. 4 GOP senators, including Mitch McConnell, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski, joined Democrats in demanding a pullback, an unheard-of defection. The effort died in the House of Representatives, where Trump's allies blocked it, but the political tremors were unmistakable. Trade wars were no longer an abstract fight with foreigners. They were threatening jobs and votes in the American heartland. Financial markets convulsed with each escalation. When Trump confirmed his tariffs on Canada in early March, U.S. stocks plunged. The S&P 500 fell nearly 2% in a single day. Within a week, Wall Street had slumped into correction territory, wiping out almost $4 trillion in market value. By mid-March, the S&P had surrendered essentially all its post-election gains. In Canada, stocks initially held firm. The Toronto Exchange was flat year-to-date, even as Wall Street sank. But the Canadian dollar seesawed with every twist of the crisis. Investors on both sides of the border were on a knife's edge, parsing every official statement for hints of a climb down. A trade relationship that once guaranteed stability was now a source of whiplash volatility. Corporate leaders on both sides of the border grew increasingly alarmed. In Washington, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce blasted the tariffs as a tax on Americans and warned they would disrupt supply chains while raising consumer prices. Analysts projected that a full 25% tariff war could shave 1.6%, 6% off U.S. GDP and cost the average American household $900 per year. CEOs from automakers, aerospace firms, and farm exporters quietly pressed the White House to find an off-ramp. In Ottawa, Canadian business groups likewise cautioned that the trade rupture could cause permanent damage. Cross-border investments were being shelved amid the uncertainty. North, America's carefully interwoven economy, the source of so many corporate profits, was unraveling, and executives feared that once supply lines moved elsewhere, they might never return. The private pleas for a truce grew urgent, even as the public rhetoric between governments only hardened. Carney soon took the showdown to his people. In late March, he called a snap election for April 28th, saying he needed a strong mandate to face the threat from Trump, who wants to break us so America can own us. It was a bold gamble, and it paid off. Canadians rallied behind their new Prime Minister's defiance. The Liberals, trailing badly in polls at the start of the year, surged on a wave of patriotic resolve, campaigning on the slogan, "Canada is not for sale." Carney won a resounding victory. The message to Washington was unmistakable. Canada would not fold. Even traditionally, U.S.-friendly voices in Ottawa were now advocating economic resistance and diversification, away from American dependence. A nation famous for politeness was now effectively telling the White House enough. Beijing and Moscow wasted no time exploiting the discord. In China, officials gleefully pointed to the U.S.-Canada feud as proof of Western disunity. The Foreign Ministry in Beijing denounced Trump's Golden Dome missile plan as a reckless move that fuels an arms race and undermines international security. Russian state media cast Washington's economic bullying of Ottawa as a cautionary tale to U.S. allies. Even North Korea chimed in, accusing America of being hell-bent on the militarization of outer space under the Golden Dome pretext. As the U.S. quarreled with one of its closest friends, its strategic rivals were smiling. Every rift in the Western alliance was an opening that China and Russia were eager to widen. Even NATO, the cornerstone of transatlantic security, was shaken. In June, at a tense summit in The Hague, Trump browbeat European allies into agreeing to raise their military spending to an unprecedented 5% of GDP by 2035. He hailed it as a big win, the so-called Hague Defense Commitment, and took credit for forcing Europe's hand. But behind closed doors, European officials murmured that if Washington could treat Ottawa like an adversary, no ally was truly safe. France and Germany accelerated plans to bolster independent European defense projects. The Western alliance had averted an open break, but the old trust was waning. Allies were rearming not just to appease Trump, but to ensure themselves against an unpredictable America. By early summer, cracks in the stalemate finally appeared. Bowing to political and market pressure, Trump agreed to pause any new tariffs for 90 days, a tentative ceasefire, but pointedly kept the punishing 25% auto tariff in force. For its part, Canada signaled openness to intensified negotiations and quietly delayed some planned countermeasures. Yet, even as the immediate crisis eased, the damage had been done. The trust and predictability that once underpinned U.S.-Canada relations had been shaken and uneasy. Calm settled in. But both nations were already moving to fortify themselves against future economic warfare. The question hanging over North America now was not just when this skirmish would truly end, but whether the old partnership could ever be the same again. Yet, amid the standoff, Canada discovered a powerful new ace. Critical minerals, modern weapons, and technology run on rare materials. And Canada is a leading supplier of 23 minerals the U.S. deems essential to national security. From uranium and nickel to rare earth elements for missiles and jet engines, Canada's resource base had become a strategic leverage point. China's recent halt of rare earth exports had already sent shockwaves through Western industries. Now Trump's trade war was imperiling U.S. access to Canada's mineral bounty. Analysts warned Washington was squandering its chance to secure these resources by alienating a close supplier. Ottawa, long the junior partner, suddenly found itself a potential kingmaker in the high-tech and defense supply chains of the West. The geopolitical ground was shifting underfoot. In May, Britain's King Charles III stood in Canada's Parliament and pointedly affirmed Canadian sovereignty. In dangerous and uncertain times, a symbolic show of support as Trump muscled in. European allies unnerved by Washington's volatility, missiles and jet engines. Canada's resource base had become a strategic leverage point. China's recent halt of rare earth exports had already sent shockwaves through Western industries. Now Trump's trade war was imperiling U.S. access to Canada's mineral bounty. Analysts warned Washington was squandering its chance to secure these resources by alienating a close supplier. Ottawa, long the junior partner, suddenly found itself a potential kingmaker in the high-tech and defense supply chains of the West. The geopolitical ground was shifting underfoot. In May, Britain's King Charles III stood in Canada's Parliament and pointedly affirmed Canadian sovereignty. In dangerous and uncertain times, a symbolic show of support as Trump muscled in. European allies, unnerved by Washington's volatility, began courting Canada directly. Carney moved to deepen those ties. He vowed that Canada would join a new European defense initiative to source and develop weapons by July 1st, explicitly to reduce reliance on U.S. arms. After decades of looking south to Washington, Canada was pivoting eastward and outward, seeking security through a broader network. The G7 was morphing into a G6+1. A North American partnership was splintering into new blocks. What had been an unshakable alliance was now open to realignment on the world stage. In Washington, officials now faced a stark truth. America's options were limited. Canada wasn't just another trading partner. It was the top foreign source of critical inputs like aluminum, steel, uranium, and potash. Replacing those supplies or bringing production home would be neither cheap nor quick. Opening a new rare earth mine, for instance, can take 17 years or more. Rewiring supply chains built over decades was like performing heart surgery on the economy. The White House floated desperate measures, subsidizing domestic mining, stockpiling minerals, courting new suppliers abroad. But none could resolve the short-term crunch. Trump's tariffs had promised to make America more secure, but instead, they revealed how dependent the nation was on the very allies and networks now under attack. The price of going it alone was turning out to be far higher than advertised. This was arguably the worst rupture in U.S.-Canadian relations in living memory. Not since the 1930s, when the Great Depression triggered a spiral of tariffs and counter-tariffs, had the two economies been so at odds. For decades after World War II, Ottawa and Washington built an intertwined powerhouse. They fought wars side by side, signed trade deals, and engineered supply chains that blurred the border. By the 21st century, Canada and the U.S. didn't just trade with each other. They built things together, from cars to fighter jets. Now that trust, painstakingly forged over generations, was crumbling. The shock was felt in boardrooms and border towns alike. Where leaders once spoke of a North American union of seamless cooperation, they now drafted contingency plans and worst-case scenarios. Both countries were asking an unthinkable question. What if the partnership underpinning their prosperity was no longer a given? By the end of that tumultuous saga, one thing was clear. This was not just a clash over dollars and cents, but a fundamental test of how the modern world is wired together. Globalization had made nations wealthy and secure by binding them in networks of exchange. Now those same networks had become weapons and targets. A policy meant to project strength instead exposed fragility at the heart of a superpower's economy. Allies were recast as adversaries. Markets turned into minefields, and the logic of collective prosperity gave way to the law of unintended consequences. The tremors from the U.S.-Canada rift spread far beyond North America, forcing every nation to rethink the balance between sovereignty and interdependence. The true toll of this confrontation cannot be counted only in dollars or jobs lost. It lies in the unraveling of certainties that once underpinned the global order. Remember to hit like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means a